Okay, hello. I think that this is working. I assume that it's working. Um, my case study was about a student in an international school here in Seoul, South Korea. He's a Saudi national, so he's a very good example of a third culture kid. A little about the school. The school is an international school. We run the International Baccalaureate curriculum, so he's in his first year, grade 6 of the middle years program. And he is in my individuals and societies, or my social studies class. And that's where a lot of my observations and my the lessons that I use with him, that's where those come from a sixth grade social studies class. And our content would best be described as like an introduction to world history and geography. And in this particular unit, right now, it's a prehistory unit. Yeah. So in part one of the case study, that was the section that asked us to develop those questions and sit down and have that conversation or that interview with the student. And basically, one of the questions that I asked him was, what's the hardest part about learning English in school? Because obviously, when he goes home, he speaks Arabic. When he is out and about here in Korea, right, everything is in Korean around him. His best friend is a Polish speaker, first language Polish. But obviously they converse in English and whatnot. So he needs to have both conversational English to talk and hang out with his friends and the language of the school. Obviously there's a ton of Korean nationals and other expats that are here, but everyone is encouraged to speak English because that's the language of instruction, and that is the language that everyone can communicate in. Where, for example, if we've got a number of Saudi kids, if they're speaking Arabic, they're excluding the Polish speaker, the Dutch speaker, whatever the case may be. So students are encouraged to always speak in English. But anyways, and not encouraged, but required to speak in English. But one of the questions I asked him was, what is the hardest part about learning English in school? And his response had to do with spelling, and spelling being the hardest because he said there's many words and I can't remember them all. And so I thought that was interesting that he finds that he needs to remember spellings, that spelling is something that needs to be memorized or remembered and not something that can be kind of sussed out or examined and figured out on the go. So that struck me as something that was interesting. And one of the things that really stuck out in this exercise and throughout the entire case study was his excitement. This is his second year in Korea, moving from Saudi Arabia. And he was excited to move to Korea, right? Going from learning in Arabic to learning in English and then living essentially in Korea and outside of his apartment is difficult. But it was something that he was excited to do, right? He comes, in his situation, it wasn't a move that was forced, right? He works at his father works in an Aramco family, and so they had this opportunity, and they made the conscious decision to come here to Korea to live and to work. So he was excited to do that, and his excitement comes throughout, and I think that was something, when I get to the conclusion, that I really focused on as an important piece to focus on going forward with the student, because I'll teach him the rest of the year, and I'll probably have him again in grade 7. So for part two has to do with comprehensible input, and this was something that I came to a lot throughout this class, and something I really tried to focus my teaching on throughout this class, our TSL 506 class, and making sure that all of the input that I gave to students, whether that was spoken or written, during instruction, during feedback, everything needs to be comprehensible input. If for example, for my student in particular, if he is in school and this is the number one place that he gets to practice English, if that input that he gets here isn't isn't at a level that he can understand, but it's also somewhat challenging, then it defeats the purpose of him practicing English, right? Everything becomes difficult again for him, and everything is essentially a wash at that point. For part 3 of this for this case study, this was where we were asked to assess the WIDA level of students, and I'm actually really glad that WIDA was such a large part of this course, because my school is just now beginning to implement WIDA as a system, and so this allowed me a good opportunity to understand what WIDA is and be part of that conversation. We've got at least one teacher here who's like our expert on WIDA, and moving forward, I think this is the second class, I think, through Spring Arbor that has used WIDA or has discussed WIDA and talked about WIDA, and now I feel like I can be a major part of that conversation. But essentially, the student that I worked with, he had a WIDA score, and the way that our system works, he's an English B, and we've got a number of students in English B, which is English language acquisition. So essentially, he's an English B. We offer Spanish B, we offer German B, we offer Chinese and Mandarin B, and those are all language acquisition courses. So, so this student is in an English B course along with 3 other students who are then in my Individuals and Societies course. But having the WIDA score, having the WIDA information about this student allows for me and allows for teachers to make some specific interventions, right, and specific goals, and say, hey, this is where X student is right now, and we want to move them to this score up here, right? And we can really look at what we're doing and see if it's working well or working at all, and make an effort, a specific effort with data and backed by research and evidence to help these students and their English language skills. In part 4, I asked my case study student, to basically just write about some of his favorite things, right? Being a Saudi national in Korea, I asked him to write about his favorite things about Saudi Arabia and his favorite things about coming to school here at Dwight. And in terms of his spelling errors, he was actually quite a good speller. I was somewhat surprised to see how correct most things were. However, his spelling of favorite and interesting, he deletes that middle syllable there. So he spelled it Favrite, and then with interesting, it was the same. It was INT. I think he spelled it RISTING. And so this kind of connects back to that first piece, that first interview, when he said, hey, spelling is something that I struggle with. Spelling is something that I find difficult because there's so many words that I have to remember. I thought this was a good example because words like favorite and interesting, we don't walk around saying, that's my favorite class. I find that textbook or I find that book interesting. People say favorite and interesting. And so he spelled it just like it sounded. And so this is actually a good example of one of those ones that he might just have to remember how to spell it, right? He might just have to remember that, oh, there's that middle piece there. And I think with this one, there is the necessity for some direct intervention and some direct teaching in terms of phonemes and how words work like that. But at the same time, I think this is a good one where more interaction with English texts will help him, because no matter how much instruction he gets in the English language, people don't walk around saying favorite and interesting. And so with that in mind, the more he sees those words, I think the more likely he'll be to spell them correctly. Part 5 was the specific lesson, and I think with this lesson, I chose it, and it went over relatively well in terms of the specific pieces, because it forced students, and in particular, it forced my case study student to read, write, listen, and speak. We read an excerpt from a textbook that he had used for his running record, actually in a previous piece. So he had already seen a part of the text and was familiar with some of it, but not the whole thing. And this required him to read out loud, to participate in a small group, he was either in a group of 2 or 3, but in a small group, to listen to other kids read, listen to other kids speak, and then also to speak himself. We essentially did a jigsaw, and he was responsible for one of the cultural universals, and had to explain his cultural universal and the evidence and the examples of that cultural universal from the Paleolithic period. And so I thought that was a pretty good exercise for him to engage in all of those pieces in one class period in varying levels of like risk-taking situations. Obviously, reading in front of the class was a difficult one for him, but I felt that since he had already had some experience with the text on just a one-to-one level, that should reduce some of that stress and some of that difficulty. Lastly, in terms of moving forward, like I said, so I'll teach him obviously the rest of the year. There's a good chance I'll end up teaching him again next year in grade 7. The biggest thing that I would take away from this would be that he was excited to be my case study student. He just left my class 15 minutes ago, and we did another exercise, and he was engaged, he was excited, and I really think that a big part of that has to do with the fact that he knows he was my case study student. He knows that I'm writing about him. He knows that a lot of my assignments were centered around him, and with that little extra bit of attention, it really made a difference to him, and it made a noticeable difference to him. And so moving forward, I want to make sure that I continue to give him that just tiny little bit of extra attention, because I think it makes a big deal, or makes a big difference. And our next unit is history fair, and it will require him to write an argumentative essay. And I think that it will be a good opportunity for me to sit down and spend some good one-on-one time conferencing very specifically about his writing, and give him that chance to do research and to write about the research that he comes up with, and to organize it, and then to talk to me about it. I think all of those steps will go a long way to really making a positive impact on his English language skills. So that would be my one major takeaway from all of this for him, is I really have seen a lot of excitement after I let him know that he was my case study student. Okay. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that wasn't too boring.